Welcome to your deep dive. So today we're diving into the Equality Act,
Yeah.
and wow, um, this one's a beast. You guys sent this in, and I got to say my first thought was, whoa, this is going to be intense.
It's definitely a big one.
Yeah, it's not just like a little tweak to the law. It's like a whole rethinking of how we do equality.
Yeah, what's really interesting about the Equality Act is it's not really about like creating new rights.
Right.
It's about taking the right to equality that like should apply to everyone
Right.
and making sure it actually does, across the board.
Yeah, it's like we say everyone's equal, but then there are all these little like loopholes and exceptions.
Exactly.
And this act is going after like all of them.
Yeah, and it tackles discrimination based on sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, all the big ones. But it goes deeper than that. It looks at how those things intersect because like in real life, it's not always just one thing, right?
Right, totally.
It's like someone might experience discrimination not just because they're a woman, but because they're a pregnant woman or because they're a lesbian and they're disabled.
Like it's never just one thing.
Right, and Ease Act gets that. It tries to create these really nuanced protections because people are nuanced.
And that's where this deep dive gets really juicy. We're going to get into all those little details because the act doesn't just say no more discrimination and call it a day. It actually breaks it down sector by sector. Like it tells you exactly where these protections apply. And it's not always obvious. I mean, of course, you've got employment, housing, that makes sense. But then it goes way beyond that.
Oh, yeah. We're talking about everything. Access to credit, loans, juries, public accommodations.
Oh, right. Like what kind of public accommodations are we talking about?
I mean, everything. Restaurants, hotels, stadiums, online businesses, even funeral homes and shelters. Like, this thing is comprehensive.
Whoa, shelters. I mean, that makes sense, though. Everyone deserves a safe place to stay.
Exactly.
Regardless.
And when we talk about employment, it's not just about, like, getting a job or not getting fired. It goes deeper. Harassment in the workplace, unequal pay for the same job, even how gender identity plays into jobs that have always been seen as, like, men's work or women's work,
Yeah, for sure.
It's really trying to get at those really deep-seated assumptions.
Right. It's like you might think, okay, obviously you can't fire someone for being gay.
Yeah.
But then there are all these other things that happen that are like sneakier.
Exactly. And the Equality Act is trying to close those loopholes. Like, imagine a trans man who's told he's not masculine enough to work construction, even if he has all the skills.
Right.
This act directly challenges those kinds of attitudes.
That's such a good example. It feels like they're really trying to think of everything. And it's not just workplaces, right? Housing is a huge one, especially for LGBTQ plus individuals.
Absolutely. And the act tackles housing discrimination head on. Like if you're denied a rental, given worse terms on a mortgage, anything like that, just because of who you are, that's covered. And that's huge because there's a ton of data showing that LGBTQ plus people face way more housing insecurity.
Which is, I mean, it's just not right.
Not at all.
And then that actually connects to another area that the act covers, which is access to credit and loans.
Yeah.
Because if you can't get a fair mortgage or, you're getting worse interest rates on your credit cards, I mean, all that stuff adds up.
Yeah, you're totally right. It's all connected. And the act recognizes that. Denying someone a loan just because they're gay or trans, charging them higher interest for no good reason, that has a domino effect on their whole life. Makes it harder to buy a house, start a business, just get by, really.
And it's not just like the practical stuff, like getting a job or a place to live, right?
Yeah.
This act even covers things like jury duty, something that most people don't even really think about that much.
Right. It's a fundamental part of our justice system. And being excluded from a jury or even just being denied the chance to serve because of your sexual orientation or gender identity, that's a big deal. It's like, are you really getting a fair trial if that kind of bias is baked into the system?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And speaking of big things, this act doesn't just impact individuals. It also affects organizations, especially when it comes to getting federal funding.
Right. That's one of the biggest things about the Equality Act, how it deals with organizations that get money from the government. It basically says if you discriminate, you could lose that funding. And we're not talking about small potatoes here. It's schools, healthcare providers, any organization that relies on federal money.
Wow. Okay, so that's a pretty big incentive for organizations to get their act together, right?
Sure.
I mean, nobody wants to lose that kind of funding.
Exactly. It's a powerful motivator for change. And speaking of change, the act also directly calls out a practice called conversion therapy. It says right in the act that it's a form of discrimination.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. I know it's been a really controversial issue, but I'll be honest, I'm not totally sure I understand what it even is.
Basically, it's any attempt to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity.
Oh,
And it's been widely condemned by pretty much every major medical and mental health organization out there.
yeah, that makes sense.
It's been linked to all sorts of terrible outcomes: depression, anxiety, substance abuse, even suicide.
That's awful. It's hard to believe that anyone would think that's okay.
Yeah, it's a really harmful practice. And that's why it's so important that the Equality Act specifically names it as discrimination. It's like drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is not acceptable.
It really does. It feels like the people who wrote this act really did their research. Like they thought of everything. Even just like the way they define their terms is important. I remember seeing how they define gender identity, and it's actually a lot broader than I think a lot of people realize.
Yeah, it's not just about being transgender. The act talks about appearance, mannerisms, and it specifically says regardless of designated sex at birth.
Right.
It's acknowledging that how someone expresses their gender might not line up with what's on their birth certificate.
Right. And that's okay.
Exactly. And they do the same thing with the definition of sex. It's not just about biology. It includes sex stereotypes, even things like pregnancy, which is considered a related medical condition.
Interesting.
They're basically saying that discrimination based on sex can take many forms, and we need to recognize all of them.
Yeah, it's like looking beyond those very narrow traditional definitions of things. And they even went so far as to update the definition of public accommodation for the digital age, which makes total sense in the world we live in now. So much of our lives are online.
Totally. I mean, in a lot of ways, ensuring equal access online is just as important as ensuring it in the physical world, right? So they made sure to include online businesses and services under that umbrella of public accommodation. It's all connected.
Yeah, for sure. It's amazing to me how much thought went into this. It's like they tried to anticipate all the different arguments and close all the loopholes they could find. But even with all that, it still hasn't been easy, right? There's still a lot of debate, especially around religious freedom.
Oh, absolutely. That's where things get really tricky. The Equality Act states very clearly that you can't use the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to get around these new protections. Essentially, it says that you can't use religious freedom as a reason to discriminate against someone.
And that's ruffled some feathers, hasn't it?
Definitely. It's one of those situations where two really important values are kind of bumping up against each other: freedom of religion and freedom from discrimination. And it's a really tough issue. We're seeing it play out in courts, in legislatures, all over the country.
It's such a tough one. It feels so fundamental, like how do you even begin to balance those two things? It really highlights just how much is riding on this act for everyone involved.
Yeah, it's a conversation about the very core of what it means to have a society where people with different beliefs and backgrounds can coexist, and it's not a conversation that's going away anytime soon, that's for sure.
For sure. So where do things stand with the Equality Act right now? Is it the law of the land yet?
Well, it's made it through the House of Representatives,
Okay.
but it's with the Senate now, so it's kind of in limbo, They have to decide if they're even going to bring it up for a vote.
So we wait. It's kind of amazing, though, when you think about it. This one piece of legislation could potentially change so much.
It really could. It touches on everything: jobs, housing, healthcare, schools, even just how our courts and public spaces function. The Equality Act is ultimately about trying to level the playing field so that everyone, regardless of who they are, has a fair shot.
And that's something we can all get behind, right? No matter where you stand on all the details, I think everyone wants a world that's more fair and just.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important to understand what the Equality Act is really all about. Even if it doesn't become law, it started a really important conversation. Like, what does equality really mean in this day and age?
Yeah, for sure. And that's what we're all about here on the Deep Dive, right? Getting people talking, getting them thinking. We've gone deep on the Equality Act today, from the big picture stuff to all little nuances that most people don't even know about. But it's not about just memorizing a bunch of facts and figures, right?
Right. This is about sparking your curiosity. What surprised you? What questions are you still wrestling with? Hold on to those, dig deeper, and keep the conversation going. That's what we want.
Exactly. All right, that's it for today's Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.